What's up guys, welcome to Wasted Space, and today I'm kicking back off an old series of mine, the Early Access Report, which, as the name might suggest, looks at games in early access from the perspective of where do they sit currently, and how is that early access process going? Are the devs listening? What's going to happen with the game in future? That sort of idea, rather than looking at it like a review. And in this case, I'm talking about a game called Master of Orion, which a lot of people will have heard of before. It was a very, very big series of games that Microprose made, kicked off back in the 90s. And I'm going to be probably approaching this from a bit of a different perspective to most of the other videos on it out there, in that I never played any of the 4X turn-based strategy games. Unlike most people that were gaming in the 90s apparently, I just never got involved with that. So I'm looking at this from a much newer perspective. Sort of the only 4X game that I've really played and had any experience with is Sins of a Solar Empire, which of course is probably the one 4X game recently that broke most of the rules, in that it's purely real-time, which is not something this genre and this series is known for. So anyway, Master of Orion hit early access 26th of February on Steam. It's being published by Wargaming, of all people, slightly unusual for them, but apparently their CEO is a massive fan of the series, which is probably a good thing. And it is essentially being marketed as a reboot of the series. It is supposed to be as authentic to the original Master of Orion as they can manage. So before I can talk at all about the state of the game, where it's going in future, or anything like that, the first thing I've got to do is explain a bit about this style of game and Master of Orion in particular. Although remembering, of course, that I'm explaining it purely from my experiences with this title rather than any of the previous ones. Currently there's no actual single-player campaign or story, so the single-player is basically a skirmish. It's the multiplayer but against AI, which in itself isn't a big deal. This sort of game is the sort of game that thrives off its actual gameplay and the stories you create yourself during a game. So you kick off as a fledgling race with a single planet under your control and a colony ship and a couple of fighters to defend it. And the goal is essentially to take over the galaxy. Although with the focus very much being on there being multiple ways of achieving this. It isn't just about stomping across the galaxy as some massive military force. And so you grow up from your single planet and expand outwards, colonizing new worlds, managing those worlds, building new structures on them, and generally trying to increase the power and influence you have in the galaxy. And you've got various different ways of doing this, like I mentioned. So there are elements where you can focus on production, or there are elements where you can focus on research, and the game has a very expansive research tree that can benefit not just, again, how powerful you are as far as military strength, but also introduce diplomacy, or unfortunately it doesn't seem like there's any element of real trade going on. But what you can do is increase how productive your race is, or how military focused they are, or how research focused they are. And occasionally with some interesting forks in the research where you're actually forced to choose one of 2 or 3 options and the others are locked out from that point on. It's not like the tree doesn't continue to grow from there, it's just some items you won't get and you'll have to pick specific ones out of those choices. Now at the moment there are 6 races in the game, but I believe that's going to be expanded to 10, which was what the original game had. So the idea is, again, it's trying to really position itself as a remake of the original game. Now, alongside your tech tree and the generic management of your planets, there's also some elements where different planet types and different star types start to have an impact on how you would handle that particular planet. And that ties a bit into the races as well, in that different races will have different favoured planet types, and also to some extent different abilities to manipulate the planets they're on. The main race I've been playing as so far, the Mershan, at least, have the ability as you go through the game and unlock more of the technology and more of the research, to initially just start terraforming their planets, but then later on terraforming them more and more towards what would be the ideal biome for them. And at the end you end up creating these sort of Gaia worlds that are hugely productive and hugely good for resource. And of course a big part of all of this is actually having a fight. This is kind of an RTS game in the end, although with a decent level of diplomacy and sort of civilization management to it as well. So in the end you're going to get into a fight. And this is potentially one of the weaker areas of the game at the moment, although I like what they're trying to do with it. And that is, most of the game is played turn-based, as you can see. We've just been clicking through turns, planning on moves, that sort of idea. But as soon as you get to combat, you move into this real-time tactical battle mode where you can actually control your units directly. And I think the idea is supposed to be have that very Sins of a Solar Empire style dynamic battle environments where you're using abilities, controlling your units, and trying to get the best out of them in a real-time environment, although admittedly with a pause button, which is quite nice. Unfortunately, they've kind of missed the boat a little bit so far with it. It's all a bit simplistic and you don't really have proper unit control. There isn't enough control over how the AI responds. They literally just, doesn't matter how big they are, doesn't matter what ship they are, they're going to charge head first at that target. And a lot of the time what they'll do is they'll charge head first at that target even if you haven't told them to. So you'll be sort of on this silly position where you're clicking backwards and forwards with your faster units to try and stop them from losing themselves way out ahead of the rest of your force and ploughing in and getting themselves killed. It is a system, though, that I think has quite a bit of potential, and this is an early access game. This is a game with development ahead of it, and in particular, they seem to be openly willing to try and accept the community's feedback. And the reason I'm saying this is because on the 11th of March, there came out a big thread of proposed changes from the community's feedback thus far, and a lot of those changes are going to improve this tactical battle quite a lot. So one of them, for example, is the ability to, when you're customizing your ships, and I'll go over the ship customization shortly, but when you're customizing those ships, you'll be able to create an AI routine for them and say, okay, I want you to primarily try and stay at range, or you're a close combat brawler. And on top of that, they're introducing more actual control over that tactical battle. So better group settings, more benefits for being in formation, and just generally more control for the player. So while it's pretty bare bones at the moment, I think it does actually have some potential if the developers follow through on some of the promises they've made so far. And I do like the sort of difference between the turn-based overlay map and then going into real time for the battles, because while turn-based battles are fun and you can arguably have a greater level of control over them, as part of that you lose pace, you lose tension, you lose that feeling of really imminent action, which real time captures much better. So as promised, I'll also talk a bit about the ship customization, because this is an area where I really like what they're doing, although it's not particularly well described in the UI exactly what's going on. But basically, every ship you have and every ship you unlock comes with like a standard blueprint. And that blueprint gets upgraded as you go through and unlock more things in the tech tree, and the system for doing so is quite nice and friendly actually as well. When you unlock stuff, it'll automatically prompt you to go and upgrade your blueprints with the new things. And if available, if you have ships in places where they can do so, so at places with star bases and ship factories, also prompts you to immediately upgrade those ships so that they're at the factory and have the new equipment fitted to them. Which introduces a tactical element I really quite like actually, this idea that your ships and your fleets are constantly needing to return back to friendly starports and friendly bases, not just to repair them up and sort of maintain them, but actually to upgrade them and keep them competitive. And you can end up with fleets that, if they've been out on the battlefield for too long, start becoming quite irrelevant because they're just underpowered. There's a really great range of different things you can put on the ships as well, different ways you can build them out to behave differently tactically, sort of everything from warp disruptors and ways of messing with missile tracking and guidance, right through to miniature wormhole generators and ways of causing your ship to detonate itself when it dies so that it takes out any nearby fighters with them. You kind of create this whole Trojan horse setup. Or you could, if it wasn't for the lack of control and the lack of actual interactivity with that tactical battle. So I think this is, again, coming back to this idea that the bedrock for a lot of what's going to be good about the game has been laid, and it's kind of hinting towards where it could go, but right now the systems aren't complete quite enough for it to all really tie together. It's the same with the diplomacy system, which seems really good, and I'm really looking forward to trying to achieve a diplomatic victory, but at the moment is just not fleshed out enough. There's too few options, and it's all a bit of a clunky system. Which is a shame, because the diplomacy actually plays quite a large role, or could do, because once every, and I think it's 25 or 50 turns, something around that, you get a meeting of the Galactic Council where there's an attempt to vote in, like, the galactic leader for all intents and purposes. And it's got this great diplomatic side to it that you don't normally see in games, this ability to kind of sway people and try and encourage people to actually like you rather than dislike you. But because the diplomatic side of things is a bit weak, it basically just comes down to you can get friendly with people and then you can pay them for votes. Another area where it could have a bit more, and another area where the devs have said that there's actually some stuff coming too. So I'm going to link that post down below in the video description because that's a really important post from them, especially if you go and read some of the Steam reviews. I like to go through the Steam reviews before I make these videos, simply because it gives me a really good idea of what the community as a whole feels. It's one of the reasons why I was slightly scared of this video, because I know that the community as a whole doesn't feel like it's a particularly good reboot of the series. It's missing a lot of what made Master of Orion great, stuff like that tactical battle system instead of turn-based stuff. From my perspective, it's completely different. I've played Sins of a Solar Empire, and for me this feels like that, but they've made bits of the global map turn-based, which I actually kind of like. What they've missed out on is the really hot, really solid RTS real-time combat that Sins did very, very well, albeit a little chuggy once the fleet sizes got it. One critical area that I have to mention, and the rest of these have been ones where I've pretty enjoyed this game so far. I've played about 7 hours before making this video, and that was because I couldn't put the thing down, to be honest. It was one of those games where legitimately you just keep saying to yourself, oh, it's just one more turn, and then I'll go and do what I need to do. And it's 3 hours later and you're still saying to yourself, oh, just one more turn. One bit that does let it down a lot, and I really feel like could break the game if they don't sort it out, is the AI. I won the very first game I played. I didn't change any of the settings, left it all on default, picked a random race, and I won that pretty easily. Never really got threatened, wasn't winning until quite near the end where I went, looks like I might lose this. I guess the best idea here is you just go and stomp all over everybody. And that's exactly what I did, and I just feel like, given my lack of experience, I definitely shouldn't have been able to win my first game. And then I went and read the Steam reviews, and it seems to be backed up there. The AI is just a bit stupid. So that's where the longevity is going to come. Lots of people love playing these games against AI, partly because they take a long time. You know, that 7 hours or so I played, that was pretty much one game, and I started a new one to look at some of the other races. But that was the length of time it took for the standard 500 turn game. So it's a long game. It means multiplayer is a big investment. So the skirmish side of things and the single player side of things is going to get played a lot by people. And if the AI is weak, that's going to harm things big style. What I also felt it meant was that there wasn't really much value to trying to be diplomatic. There wasn't really any value to try and achieve any sort of other win condition, because in the end, all you really needed to do was just go and stomp on them. Go and stomp on them, you're going to win. So there's a really important part there that they've got to sort out, I think, to make this great. But otherwise, I really quite enjoyed my time spent with Master of Orion so far. And I really hope that they do address some of these sort of smaller issues, because at the moment I think it's a good game. It stands on its own. It's not the tribute to Master of Orion that people were looking for, I don't think, yet. It's kind of perhaps a homage to it to some extent. Perhaps people are treating it a bit harshly because that's, I guess, how it's being branded, as a reboot rather than a similar game, not quite the same, with new ideas and sort of new approaches. But what I have to take as massively positive is how quickly the developers came back, listened to all of that feedback, and legitimately seemed to be trying to address those issues and trying to make it the game that people wanted it to be. Whether or not that all coalesces into that final awesome product, I don't know, and it's a long way before we can tell that yet. But I think from the early access perspective, this is a very good start. It's taken them, 15 days to go from a product that looks very polished for an early access release and has some pretty high budget behind it. You know, it looks really nice, to come back out again with a really big plan of, here's all the feedback we've taken from you, here's all the things we're going to try and do about that to try and address it and try and make it the game you wanted. To really get that thousands of hours longevity that I know the original Master of Orion had for some people, it's going to need some of this stuff addressing, especially as it's being priced quite high. So it's quite a tough challenge for the devs to really get on top of all of these issues. But it does look like they might just be game for it. So I guess I'll end up by saying, was this the game that the Master of Orion fans were looking for? So far, not really. Is it potentially going to become that game? I think it could. And is it potentially going to stand on its own regardless? If you take away that whole reboot of Master of Orion thing and instead look at it as a homage, a bit of a tribute, but not quite the same idea, something that's trying to maybe modernize in some areas, then I think it's really not very far away from doing that. So there you go, guys. Not by any means a complete rundown of what Master of Orion is all about, nor in any way a review of the game. That, I think, is best saved for the point at which you're actually got a game nearing release, and they've had chance to go through this sort of early access period, especially with developers that listen, and that seems to be becoming something that's, at least in some areas, more and more of a thing. Developers that really do rely on early access to push their games to the point where they'll be successful, and that benefits everybody. Bit of a different video for me, of course. An old series I kind of enjoy just because of its perspective. It's about progress, not necessarily about review and judgment or anything like that. You guys can kind of make up your own mind whether this is the sort of game that's going to be for you, or whether it's a game you want to check back on in the future, see whether they've improved some of the things I've been talking about. If you did like this, of course, please hit that like button. Please hit subscribe, really helps me in the channel out. And if you didn't like it, well, you know where the dislike button is. By all means, click that one. But if you can, also hit me up down in the comments with some idea of how I could improve, what it was you didn't enjoy. So thanks a lot for watching, guys, and I will catch you next time.